Oh, didn't see you there. Well, I know what you're here for. I'm sure you're here for the story. Not the story about my friend Harambe here, but the story about oral communication. That is the book that we used for our public speaking class this year with Dr. Pamela Dykes. The book was Oral Communication, Skills, Choices, and Consequences by Catherine Sue Young and Howard Paul Travis. And today, we're going to be talking about that book, and I'm going to take you through chapter by chapter and give you the highlights of the most important parts of the book, so that you too can master public speaking like we did this semester. So chapter 1 talked about why communication is important. And the chapter said that, and I agree, that we need it for everything. Communication is used in every facet of our lives. And the more that we use communication, the more we need to use communication in our world, means that we need to be more effective with it. So the more effective we are in communicating, the more we stand out in what we do. And the book also talked about how there are 3 main points to communication. The 3 basic points are, number 1, that it is a two-way process. Number 2 is that it can be intentional or unintentional. And number 3 is that it's always occurring, whether we know it is or not. So we need to be more and more aware of ways that we are communicating. Chapter 2 talked about the perception of communication and about the perceptual process. And in the perceptual process, there are 3 steps. The first is selection, and that's when you take in information and you decide which parts are worth recognizing. Step number 2 is organization. Organization is when your brain groups these things that you're selecting into groups, and then in those groups you recognize them. And then step 3 is interpretation. So after you assign these groups and organize them in your brain, then you assign all of them meaning. And then that determines how you recognize them and how they are organized in your brain. Now, you can't control the perceptual process of all the people that you see, but there is one way that you can influence people's perceptual process of yourself, and that is through what's called branding. In branding, since you can't control others' perception process, you try to represent yourself the way that you want others to perceive you, by altering your actions and your appearance and things like that. An example is with me. I like people to think that I'm quirky and fun, yet smart, so I wear quirky little golf sweaters like this, with this little guy that's going out for 9 holes. And then I also have this man bun, so people know that I'm hip and quirky. But then I also wear the glasses, so that people know that I'm smart. I wear these nice shoes, so people know that I'm still kind of sporty. So, that's my own personal brand, all the different mixes. Chapter 3 talked about language. You must understand that, language, and that language is important to make appropriate communication choices. So you have to understand the way that other people interpret the language that you use. And some of the ways that it talked about are symbol, one of the main ways of language. Symbol is an arbitrary representation, and we choose a word and send it across a channel to someone else to convey meaning about something that we see. There are 2 forms of symbols, and it comes across in 2 different meanings. There is denotative meaning, which just means the dictionary form of something, so the actual words themselves and what they mean. And then there's connotative meaning. And connotative meaning is the feelings and emotions attached to the words. And the wrong connotation could lead to a misunderstanding. So if I just talk about the Holocaust, it may just be something that we all understand as what it was. But then for somebody who may have a family member who was in the Holocaust, who may have been Jewish, then that gives a totally different connotation to them and means something totally different. And if I just talk about it lightly, then it could lead to a misunderstanding in communication. Chapter 4 talked about nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication radiates from all the senses, but does not include verbal symbol. So it includes our 5 other senses, and it broke these down into different types of nonverbal communication in the chapter. The first was body movement, and then it had time, smell, and touch communication. And then there was also paralanguage communication, spatial communication, and artifacts. Now, most of those make sense to us just based on what they are and the names that they have. But paralanguage communication may not make too much sense to us. And paralanguage communication is how you say the words that you say. So if I were to say, "Good to see you," with a positive spin on it, then you know that's a paralanguage nonverbal cue. And then if I say, "Good to see you," then you know that that may be more negative, even though the words themselves are positive. So paralanguage, although it involves words, is nonverbal. Chapter 5 talked about interpersonal communication. And interpersonal communication is two or more people in personal or professional relationship. And in the chapter, it talked about how one of the most important parts of interpersonal communication is self-disclosure and giving personal information to someone else. And one of the best ways to express self-disclosure in interpersonal communication is just in conversation. So you have to know to what degree you are able to share these personal things that you're sharing. And these are just extemporaneous interpersonal exchanges. So the process of conversation begins with an opening, and then there is the body, which is the mass of the conversation itself, and then a closing. And if you want to be good at conversation itself, you need to master all three and master the level of self-disclosure that you're going to practice. Chapter 6 talked about the relationship stages and conflict resolution. It defined relationships as an interpersonal communication and said that it is complex and that it develops, and that there are 5 stages to relationships. The first is contact, second, involvement, third, intimacy, fourth, deterioration, and fifth is either repair or dissolution. And as the deterioration step would infer, all relationships are going to have forms of conflict, or reach some form of conflict, whether it's large or small. And there are 5 types of resolution to conflict. And that is competing, avoiding, accommodating, compromising, or collaborating. Now that we've covered the different types of communication, the book in Chapter 7 began to speak about writing a speech, which is what this class was all about. Chapter 7 talked about the initial speech preparation that you have to do whenever you're writing a speech. And the important part is that you have to design your speech. And it broke the speech design up into 2 separate categories. The first is the planning step, which includes selecting your general purpose and selecting your topic, and then narrowing that topic you selected down to make it more specific, and then organizing key factors and features of this of your speech, writing down your goal statement of what you want to get out of the speech, or the audience to get, and then writing down your thesis to give a compact statement of the goal of the speech, and then analyzing the audience that you're giving the speech to. The second is the creating process, which involves research, organizing, outlining, and selecting your delivery style of the speech, which includes visual aids, and then you have to practice. Chapter 8 talked about how to construct your speech. The first most important step of constructing your speech is conducting research. You have to use sources and outlets to back up your 3 main speaking points that you developed in the planning stage of your initial speech preparation. Your 3 main sources that you want to use for research are the internet, the library, and also you could conduct interviews. Chapter 9 talked about presenting the speech. There are 4 types of delivery and styles of delivery whenever it comes to delivering your speech. The first is impromptu, which means there's no preparation at all. The second is manuscript, which means you're just reading straight from the speech. The third is memorized, which you write things down and then you commit certain parts to memory. And then the fourth is extemporaneous, which means you just have keywords that you use to almost promote sort of a conversation style in the speech itself, but most of it is just done through memorization and then also a creative way of engaging the audience. Another important part of presenting your speech is visual aids. Visual aids help to clarify a concept by something the audience can see with their eyes. Chapter 10 talked about the principles of persuasion. Persuasion is defined as influencing attitudes, beliefs, values, or actions of the audience. So the goal of the persuasive speech is to create some sort of change within the person that you're speaking to. And as we saw in our own class this year, a lot of people get confused on the difference between informative and persuasive speeches. And the book in Chapter 10, if they had read it, they would know that it talked about the difference between informative and persuasive speeches. An informative speech is something that you're just giving the audience information that you want them to remember regarding a certain subject. But a persuasive speech is giving them information and asking them to act on the information that you've given them in the speech. Chapter 11 talked all about the persuasive speech and about the presentation whenever you're giving a persuasive speech. You have to develop a reasonable goal and a call to action out of your persuasive speech. So you can't ask the audience to do something that's just wild and change the entire world, but you have to give them some small step to act on whatever information that you're giving them regarding your topic that you want to persuade them about. The building blocks of persuasion, which are from Aristotle, are ethos, which is credentials, logos, which is logic, and pathos, which is emotions. And these are the three things that you appeal to your audience based on. Chapter 12 talked about interviewing, and more so about interview skills for us to learn. And there are two parts to interviews. The first part is demonstrating effective communication in order to obtain employment or promotion. The second step, part of an interview, is the resume section, which is a written summary of the accomplishments that you've made in the past, and both work together to make the interview. And the final chapter, chapter 13, talked about working in teams. Groups need leaders, and groups are what you are people who are individuals who have similar ideas or goals and want to complete a task. Groups sort of like Emily and I, who worked on this speech together. And then groups also have to have a leader. So the leader is somebody that is either appointed or who emerges, and then they help to make the group as a whole more effective by delegating tasks and different things like that. And that summarizes the book, with the exception of the summary that came from the authors. But in conclusion, I'm glad that you now all have learned the basic necessities of being an effective communicator and effective public speaker. So maybe one day you'll become a doctor. And maybe one day you'll even be able to teach your own fundamentals of speech class yourself. Maybe, I don't know.